أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Jummah Mubarak to all of you and your loved ones. I'd like to take this opportunity this afternoon to welcome our guest speaker, Brother Haroon Aziz. Just for a short introduction, Brother Haroon Aziz is a author, writer, researcher, and an analyst, and he's written a number of books. His topic of discussion this afternoon, the pre-khutbah talk, is the role of the Muslims in the freedom struggle in South Africa. Due to time constraints, I would like to urge Brother Haroon to come up immediately and deliver his talk.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My topic for this afternoon is Muslim contribution to the heroic struggle for freedom in South Africa, and it covers a period from 1668 to 1994. The premise of my talk is based on Surah Al-Asr, which translates into the flight of time. It's according to the translation of Muhammad Asad. Surah Al-Asr has a few elements on it. The first element is historical time, and historical time is finite time. The second element is faith. The third one is the good actions of human beings. The fourth one is truth, and the last one is patience. Surah Al-Asr deals with the finite historical time, and it deals with the chaos that exists in history even up to today. What is the chaos of history? There are four things that cause the chaos of history. The one was apartheid that we had gone through. Two is colonialism that still exists, even in a place like Sahrawi Republic. The third is imperialism, which exists all over the world. And the fourth, and the most hated one, is Zionism. Now, Muslims in South Africa, they were guided by Surah Al-Asr, and they developed Islamic techniques to help contribute towards the defeat of apartheid in South Africa. And these techniques are laid out in Surah Al-Asr. Muslims have helped to overcome apartheid as the chaos of history. And there are still three other chaos of history that are still to be fought. Now, in Islam, time consciousness is very important. We all know that. Surah Al-Asr is historical time, which is finite time. And infinite time is called Dar. And Imam Ali has written beautifully on the concept of Dar, or infinite time. Now, in the Muslim mind, Asr and Dar combine as the convergence of the concept of Fid Dunya wal Akhirah. Muslims live both for this world and for the hereafter. Now, this concept of Fid Dunya wal Akhirah gives Muslim the sense of accountability. Accountable, firstly, to our own conscience, two, to the people that we serve, and three, to Allah. This sense of accountability gives us the internal motivation to be very active in our life. So active that the internal compassion that we develop leads us into outward action from which people benefit. Now, the character of the Muslim pioneers in South Africa is characterized by faith. And just now we will go into that. Now, 1,000 years ago, when the Arab cartographers were drawing up the map of Africa, they designated southern Africa as Zanj. And from Zanj, you get the word Zanzibar, you get the word Azania. So, in terms of Arab cartography, this place was called Zanj, the land of the unknown. Now, at that time, there was Nizam al-Mulk of the Ottoman Empire. And he developed and he institutionalized and he globalized education throughout the world, or the Ottoman Empire. And his leadership was based on the 400 books that were written by Imam al-Ghazali. And of that 400 books, only 70 survive today. So Imam al-Ghazali provided the brains for Nizam al-Mulk to institutionalize and globalize education in the Ottoman Empire. Now, 1,000 years ago, neither Nizam al-Mulk nor Imam al-Ghazali could have foreseen that today in the land of the unknown, that there's an al-Ghazali college standing in Pretoria, and there's a Nizamiya Masjid standing in Midrand. So these were people of great visions. Now, the first person to bring Islam to southern Africa was a person called Sheikh Mateba from Indonesia. And that was on May 13, 1668. And we are fortunate to have some guests from Indonesia here in this masjid, and they'll be running a youth camp over this weekend. And they are bringing forward the values, the leadership qualities of people that ran the Ottoman Empire, the Umayyad Empire, and the Abbasid Empire. Sheikh Mateba was from Sumatra, and he was brought as a political prisoner and deposited on Robben Island. So the first seed of Islam, or the first seed of Iman, was planted on Robben Island. And after he had served his sentence, he was released, and he was sent to the forest, wild forest, a place called Constantia. Today, it is an upmarket suburb. And in the forest, he taught Islam to Malaysian, Bengali, and other slaves. Now, in Islam, we're very fortunate. We have what we call the chemistry of faith. The moment you take the Shahada, the neurochemicals and the neurohormones in our brains change. And our whole life changes, and we live by faith. Now, Desmond Tutu was so fascinated by Islamic faith that he intended writing a thesis on Islamic faith, but he never got down to it. But this is what he said about Islamic faith. He said, Islam is a potent force in Africa. To carry on a dialogue with Muslims, we must know their faith well. Quote and unquote, Desmond Tutu. So we said the seeds of faith were first planted on Robben Island. The second one was in the forest of Constantia. So which means Sheikh Mateba came with nothing material, but only with Iman. And we know throughout the world, Iman is the basis of Islamic civilization. And the material things that grow or exemplify Islamic civilization, like this masjid, for instance, it comes out of the seed of faith that all Muslims have. So we say faith or Iman is the foundation of Islamic civilization. Faith is also the organizing principle of Islamic civilization. We don't follow a human being because he's popular. If he's a man of faith, we will follow him. And what comes out of faith are buildings, masjids, madrasas, darul ulums, and it provides social cohesion, religious cohesion, and cultural cohesion. The other prisoner of conscience that was brought to South Africa was the famous Sheikh Yusuf. He was brought in 1664 and he was captured in Makassar. Again, Indonesia is involved. And Sheikh Yusuf had studied for 20 years in Mecca and Medina. And after he had completed his studies, he was prevented from returning to his hometown. So he served as a counselor to a sultan in Bantam in Java. And he had taken part in the 3-year war from 1680 to 1683. It was a war of independence by the Indonesians against the Dutch colonizers. So Sheikh Madebe came as the prisoner of conscience in 1684. He was first imprisoned in Batavia, and the Dutch could not hold his ideas from spreading. So they took him out from Batavia and they sent him to Sri Lanka. And there he spent 10 years in exile. And even in exile, they couldn't hold back his ideas. So they exiled him to a faraway place called Cape Colony. So he was brought here on April the 2nd, 1694. And with him came 15 other Muslims. And they were dispatched to a place called Zandvliet then. Today it's called Makassar. And they were given by the Dutch colonizers a resettlement cost of 12 Rix dollars, which was equal to less than 11 pennies per exiled person. That was the cost of so-called resettlement. So Sheikh Yusuf set up the first Muslim community in southern Africa. And he had come 10 years after the death of Sheikh Matebe. So which means the germs, the seeds which Sheikh Matebe had set, they lay germinating and they awaited the arrival of the 51 Muslims from Indonesia. And Sheikh Yusuf and his community gave continuity to Muslim identity that was hidden in the forest of Constantia. And Islam started serving as a liberating force, because at that time, Christianity was an instrument of oppression. And they tried to use Christianity as an ideology to oppress Muslims and others ideologically and mentally. Now, on the 27th of September 2005, the Democratic State in South Africa conferred the Order of the Champions of OR Tambo in gold on Sheikh Yusuf. This was 306 years after his death. And it coincided with the 36th anniversary of the martyrdom of Imam Haroon. In 1716, Sheikh Mubin came. He came as a prisoner, and he taught Islam in the underground, and he was well renowned for his physical stamina. At the age of 80 years, he was still doing hard labor, and he taught Sufism to the slaves and the exiles and ex-prisoners. And he developed the concept of freedom of thinking, or free thinking, in very oppressive conditions. And that freedom of thought is today guaranteed by the South African Constitution. So Sufism came as an intangible asset of Islamic civilization, just as Iman was brought as the intangible asset of Islamic civilization. Then on November the 16th, 1860, Indian slaves who were called indentured laborers were brought. There were 342 slaves from India, and 24 of them were Tamil-speaking Muslims. And Hazrat Bashapir was one of them. And he had sown the first seed of Iman in Durban. Now, the slaves in Natal, they were subjected to barbaric punishment. The women were whipped on their heads for failing to deliver the quotas of work. They were verbally abused to exact production, and they were willfully inflicted with injuries, and they were sentenced to imprisonment for hard labor. Now, we can see from this little synopsis that the establishment of Islamic civilization in southern Africa was not a Sunday picnic. It involved pain and suffering. It involved blood, sweat, and tears. And then came later, after Hazrat Bashafir came Hazrat Sufi Saib, and he institutionalized Islam in Natal colony. Then on the 4th of August 1873, so-called Zanzibari slaves were brought, because the slaves were not only from Zanzibar, they were also from Comoros Island. And altogether, there were 420 slaves brought from Comoros and Zanzibar. After they had served the term of slavery, they were released into a place called King's Rest, which consisted of about 5 hectares of land. And there they faced an identity crisis. And they had practiced Sufism, which was imported from Persia or Iran. And the apartheid government did some race engineering with the Zanzibaris and the people from Comoros. They had labeled them in terms of race engineering, firstly as lost tribes, then they were labeled as freed slaves, then they were called Bantus, then they were called Coloureds, then other Asians, and other Asiatics. They were uprooted from King's Rest within 3 days of legal notice, and they were dumped in a place called Chatsworth. Now, let's go back to 684 in the Common Era, when Islam came to Zimbabwe. Islam was brought to Zimbabwe by the followers of Suleiman and Said, who had fled from Oman. And in 1720, there were further followers of Zayd that fled Yemen that came. They were persecuted for their rebellion against Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan and his successors in the 5th Umayyad Caliphate dynasty. They had reached a place called Sofala in Mozambique, and from there they found their inland route to Zimbabwe, where they brought in their expertise and they helped in building up what was called Zimbabwe fortifications. Today it's called Zimbabwe ruins. They had brought with them certain expertise in terracing land, in mining, irrigation, agriculture. And we know the Umayyad dynasty was well known for developing commerce, agriculture, engineering, architecture. The Umayyads has also minted the first money in the Muslim world. They innovated postal service, and they created literature in the Arabic language. And they built what is now called the Dome of the Rock. They had also built a Baitul Mal in Al-Quds, and they had converted an entire nation of slaves called the Slavs to Islam in Bosnia. So Islam came also via the Transvaal through the migrant labor system, which was brought to the Transvaal by workers from Zimbabwe and Malawi. And the Malawians in particular, they brought in letters of the alphabet. And they were the first among the Africans to have an alphabet system and a numeral system. There is very clear evidence that all pioneering Muslims, they were, number one, people of the book and the hand. Number two, they planted seeds of faith without material possessions. And thirdly, they brought in intangible and then the tangible assets of Islamic civilization were founded in South and Southern Africa. Nelson Mandela said, South Africa's own Islamic heritage has been a vital part of our history. Our country can proudly claim Muslims as brothers and sisters, compatriots, freedom fighters, and leaders, revered by our nation. Now, in 1960, when the ANC was banned, Nelson Mandela gave the leadership in forming the armed wing of the ANC called Umkhonto weSizwe. Now, Umkhonto weSizwe was developed on the model of the FLN in Algeria. President Mandela learned his first basic lessons in guerrilla warfare from the Algerians. The challenges that still remain for us to end neo-colonialism, imperialism, and Zionism. What are the challenges that face youth? I'll just mention a few. The one is to overcome terrorism and bitterness. 2, to promote dialogue and mutual consultation. 3, to mobilize 1.8 billion youths around the world. And I think the camp which the Indonesians are going to run at this college this weekend is part of that movement where we're trying to mobilize 1.86 billion youths. And to promote peace through security and safety, and to learn lessons from hardships and not be overcome by hardships. The main challenge that faces the entire anti-imperialist movement, particularly the Muslims, is to liberate Palestine from Zionism and imperialism. Jazakallah for listening.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Once again, Jumma Mubarak to all of you and our dear viewers on ITV. Jazakallah to Brother Haroon Aziz for giving us this lesson in history. I think what is very, very interesting to note is that our deen came through freedom fighters. It took root in South Africa through freedom fighters. Went on to the oppressed to liberate them, to liberate their minds. And Alhamdulillah, today we have the privilege of being called Muslim and following the deen of Islam. Are we good representatives? That is the question that we should ask. Are we taking this deen forward? Are we spreading the message? That is our challenge. More importantly, are our children in the so-called Islamic schools getting this message, this historical message of how this deen came to this country? And I do believe that Al-Ghazali College is teaching this particular, in Islam, this lessons. It's very, very important that we know our roots. Jazakallah, Brother Haroon Aziz. Brothers, we have been asked to make dua, special dua for Brother Faisal's wife. She went for a op, I think this morning, and inshallah for her and all the others that need our prayers, may Allah grant them shifa.
تبسم تبسم وخل الهموم وخل الغموم وخل الضجر